My Junkerqueen guide is almost 3 years old and probably the worst guide I've ever made. Let's change that. Junkerqueen's unique selling point, or USP, is her knife. Landing or not landing knives can be the difference between carrying on Queen or just being mediocre and getting ran over. Look to path or rotate in the mid-fight to land knives on squishies, and take your time with not only hitting the knife, but landing your follow-up combos too. Use commanding shout to enable or disable aggression, avoid passing through open space to prevent taking tons of damage on entry, and use Rampage in the mid-fight to revert enemy aggression. Queen's weapon, the TF2 Scout Scattergun, is a short-range weapon that deals 80 damage on body shots with 8 shots in a clip. There's 2 simple but key ideas here. The first is making sure that you've got a full clip before you start brawling. You don't want to knife a target and be unable to follow up because you need to reload. Just do it behind a corner or before you walk in. Secondly, as with any close range weapon in the game, ensure you've got good trigger discipline when firing your scattergun up close. Your pellets are hit scan, and enemies move faster relative to how close up they are on screen. So taking the extra half a second to readjust your crosshair to land the juicy meat shots could be the difference between landing a kill or not. Queen's first ability, Hog Hook but worse, makes Queen toss out a knife that deals 65 damage on impact and 30 additional damage over 3 seconds. If you hit a target, you can pull them in at any time, and if you miss a target but retract the knife through them, you will deal 15 wound damage over 3 seconds. Not to mention, the cooldown is 6 seconds. Hopefully the editing version of myself will put clips in the background of Queen players hitting their knives and confirming many kills based off it. Tons and tons of lower level Queen players will just toss out their knife without any thought to actually hit it. It needs to be treated like a hog hook instead of a random disposable cooldown. If you are not already locked in on hitting your knives consistently, you will see a notable increase in the amount of knives you hit just by focusing a little. I might as well get your passive out the way too, called Adrenaline Rush, which currently heals back 225% of the wound damage that you deal. Because your sustain is a passive ability, I can't really give much actionable advice when it comes to getting the most out of it, but what I will say is that this becomes even more of a reason to actually hit your cooldowns, which will start triggering your passive healing. If you hit a knife, that is a free 67 healing. Now to the combos. The first is to shoot, knife, start your axe swing animation, then retract your knife and hit your axe, followed up with a shot and a melee. You don't have to hit every single part of this combo, but if you do, you can deal up to 370 damage excluding wounds, or 455 damage including wounds, and that's not even mentioning headshots. You can see Jumpin do this combo here, and while he doesn't hit a single shot, the reason why you Carnage before you retract the knife is just so you don't have to wait for that long ass Carnage animation. Of course, you can Carnage after, so that you don't waste it in case they use an escape cooldown after your knife retracts. The more simple combo that you will likely be doing is to shoot, then knife, then retract it, and land a shoot plus melee combo. On paper, this does up to 265 damage, excluding bleed, and up to 310, including bleeds. This is especially useful to do if you haven't got Carnage, as you can see Crocs do here in this example. In terms of usage, it's really not that complicated. Knife is one of those abilities that are simple in conception, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. One of the most common questions about knife is, who do you actually knife? Is it worth knifing the tank, the support, or DPS? Well, the answer, which you're not gonna like, is that it depends. Generally speaking, you want to be knifing more killable targets, or targets that if you do knife, you know you're gonna force a key cooldown out of. For example, against this enemy comp, knifing the Lucio or Juno is generally going to be pretty hard due to their hitboxes, mobility, and where they might be playing. Hitting a knife onto an Ashe can be great, but she might be hard to hit depending on where she plays. That primarily leaves us with Mei and Ram being the most reliable knife targets on the front line, and generally, Mei is going to be more killable than Ram. If you hit a knife onto a Mei, you're more than likely going to force out a cryo, or even her wall, both of which are great trades for knife. Conversely, maybe there's a Kiriko in the enemy team and you need to force out Suzu, so you're extra attentive to hit knives on overextending Kirikos. As you can see, it's context dependent. There's some other bits of knife micro, like keeping the knife in the enemy so you can move around and retract it to pull them in a place they don't want to be in. I'm sure I'll put an example of this in the background. And conversely, there's some cases where you might not want to retract your knife at all. If you're running away from annihilation, knifing the enemy Ramatra and pulling him closer to you might not be what you want to do. However, if he's close to ending his form, knifing him towards the end and pulling him when he exits Nemesis can be pretty potent. Queen's second ability, B-Tech Rhinehammer, makes Queen slash an axe across the enemy, dealing 105 damage, as well as 40 bleed damage over 3 seconds on an 8-second cooldown. However, for every target you hit with Carnage, it decreases the cooldown by 2 seconds. I'm not gonna lie, just like Rhinehammer, there isn't much more to talk about Carnage than there is with Hammer. You can swing your camera around to manipulate the hitbox and hit multiple targets, and of course, you can charge up your Carnage behind corners, but this is all fairly basic stuff. And of course, there's the combos I went over in the last section, pulling enemies close to slash them after. However, a topic I don't see talked about at all is when it's beneficial to not Carnage, and actually when it's better to miss a Carnage to preserve your own life. This might sound a bit crazy, but bear with me for the next 2 minutes as I explain this with an example from Junbin. So I was watching Junbin's POV and I noticed a very subtle mistake that has got 2 very damning implications. Firstly, because this is from Junbin, right, who's playing on the best team in the world, so if he's making this mistake, then you are as well. And secondly, it's so subtle that you might not even notice it, or you might misattribute it to something else, right? So we'll play the clip here, and I'm not going to say anything because I want to see if you guys can actually spot it. But we'll play the clip here and see how it goes. Right, so what's the mistake that Junbin there makes? Now, initially to some people it might just be like, oh well, he shouldn't have crossed the gap forehead because he gets his shout forced, he's in open space, he's not in a good position, yada yada yada, right? But that's kind of hindsight, because in reality, like, if you're Junbin here and you're full HP with full cooldowns, right, basically full HP, maybe you could have waited a second, who cares, right? He's got a man advantage here, and frankly, he should be pushing slowly, which I think in fairness he is doing, to be fair. And actually, if you play the clip even more, even though he gets a shout forced, he's actually safe here. The mistake is actually greeting the Carnage for legitimately 0 reason. So we'll play it here and you can see what I mean. And it becomes obvious once I point that out, right? Where he sees Heesung jump in on Winston, he thinks he's punishable, but he doesn't realize, or he doesn't put enough importance on the aggro he's taking from these DPS over here, on the fact that he's half HP, and on the fact that he's also lost his commanding shout, right? He doesn't put enough stress on that, so he ends up greeting the Carnage. The overall point that I don't want you guys to miss here is you shouldn't die for Carnage. That's the simple point being made. It is super easy to get lost in the fact that there's so many small benefits to hitting Carnage that, you know, you can actually die for it. That's something I wanted to bring up here because it becomes obvious once you point it out, but don't greed your Carnage if it means you're going to die, right? Maybe if we look at this in another scenario, right, maybe in a different world, if Junbin was full HP and he also had commanding shout, then maybe he can actually walk here and go onto the Winston because he can live that, right? And therefore, he can actually greet the Carnage. But in this situation here, there's no reason to do that. Queen's third ability, Cryo Fear, adds 175 health to Queen, 50 HP to those around Queen, as well as a 30% speed boost on a 12-second cooldown. The duration is 5 seconds for you, and 3 seconds for allies. To explain how Queen Shout works, I kinda need to do a brief history lesson on how it used to work. I'm sure many of you already know, but Queen Shout used to be so broken that it spawned the so-called Jokes meta on her release. Queen Shout applied 100 healing to teammates instead of 50 and lasted for 4 seconds overall. Not to mention, it was on a shorter cooldown too. I bring this all up to say that Queen Shout back then was a heavy piece of team utility specialized in enabling the aggression of her teammates, specifically her Genji, instead of her own aggression. That's now changed. Now obviously, there's nuance here. In this very recent example by Toronto Defiant, the Queen shouts her Genji as soon as he blades in. But the overall point I'm trying to make is that shouting for teammates is kind of a secondary use. The primary use is about enabling your own selfish aggression. Either you're making an aggressive play, or someone is making an aggressive play on you. In this example, you can see Croc shout because he's about to make a very aggressive play on the Lucio. He wants the extra speed to catch him by surprise, and the extra HP to absorb the aggro. He shouts for the same reasons here when he knifes the Cassidy because he wants to aggress off the knife he hits. Of course, there are going to be defensive examples of him shouting, like in this case here, to escape the blizzard, using both the speed and HP to avoid the aggro. However, I do want to mention this idea of not wanting bad positioning to force bad cooldowns. In other words, you don't want to get your shout forced because your positioning wasn't great. For example, in this situation, R3K on Queen splits himself when the enemy Venture ends up burrowing in. This means that he gets isolated and shot from multiple different angles, which leads to his shout being forced. Another common case when Queen players get bad shouts off is when they traverse through open space. In this example, R3K pops his shout early, just across the open space and reach Hanbin. But look at how far Hanbin plays off the corner. As a result, it's super easy to disengage and melt R3K, and Hanbin just feels like he's got a permanent HP advantage. Capitology talked about this idea of baiting and playing off corners, so credit to him for this idea. Queen's ultimate, the windmill, makes Queen charge forward, dealing 40 impact damage and 90 wound damage over 4.5 seconds. Targets that are hit also receive an anti-nade effect for the duration. Thankfully, Queen ult is both simple and easy to get value out of, at least in the current meta right now. As long as the enemy team don't have a Kiriko, or they don't have sustain cooldowns like Cryo or Fade that can cleanse your ultimates, it can be a pretty decent option to open up a fight and win it quickly. Alternatively, and what we've been seeing a lot fairly recently, is Queen players using Rampage to revert aggression from the enemy team. If the enemy team push with Orbital Ray for example, you can pop Queen ult to slice through the healing. You can see Crocs clutch an entire fight because of how potent Queen ult can be, but I do want to briefly break down how and why this works. So anyone who's watched my content for some period of time will already be familiar with these triggers or advantages, but in short, they are ult advantages, they are positional, they could be cooldown based, they could be numbers based, and they could also be HP based. Now, I would argue in this scenario, every single one of those triggers or advantages applies to Crocs in some kind of way. Ult advantage, very obvious, he's got Queen ult right there, so right here, yeah, he's our nemesis right now. Crocs also has the shout that just came back off cooldown, as well as the Carnage swing as well, so he's got a cooldown advantage he can utilize. There's also the HP advantage because he's actually full HP or basically close to it. He's also getting healed by Orbital Ray. Comparatively, the enemy Ramattra is very low right now, and the Ashe is also half HP. He's also got a positional advantage because the entire enemy backline are playing on low ground, swinging the corner, and they're all playing in such a way where Crocs can hit all of them with a Rampage. And the last advantage, which isn't explicit, is numbers. Now, sure, right, Crocs does not have a numbers advantage technically speaking, because he's currently in a 1 versus 4 scenario. But I mean numbers in terms of how many people he can affect it, right? Because if the Ashe and if the Juno just played on high ground, or they played in such a way where they can't be hit by the Rampage here, then Crocs doesn't really have a numbers advantage that he can utilize, because he can never reach the Juno or Ashe if they're playing high grounds. So with all of this in mind, Crocs eventually pops the Queen ult here, and clutches the fight, getting 3 easy kills, or fairly easy kills there. That was actually a very good knife hit onto the Juno, but the Juno would have died regardless. Of course, I have to talk about Suzu and trying to outplay it. Generally speaking, the most common way is to pressure out a single target so much that it forces the enemy Kiriko to pop Suzu on themselves, which allows a free Queen ult. If you knife an Ashe, and the only way of saving them is to use Suzu, then the Kiriko is forced to make a choice. Use Suzu, in which case you just Queen ult after, or the Kiriko lets them die, in which case you're at an advantage anyways. Your team can help in this too by popping their own ultimates, saving Rampage for later into the fight, where the Kiriko is less likely to have the Suzu. Onto the penultimate section, being macro based around compositions. Now, I don't want to tread over old ground, but I think one of the biggest challenges Queen players face is crossing open space without getting too many resources forced out. I just briefly brought this up too in the commanding shout section. I've also talked about this beforehand in my brawl guide, and Queen is especially bad at traversing open space, considering you haven't got a shield or a fast moving stomp ability. I talked about 4 ways you can overcome this, but they're all fairly team related, and I am aware of the audience that's likely watching this video. Still, I think it's a useful resource, so skip the section 4b of that video if you want to know more. Instead, I want to focus on something that you can do yourself in your own games, which is pathing around the enemy team to specifically avoid open space. Here's future me talking about it here. The second he sees the Ramattra turn the corner like this, like he shows the hitbox of Ramattra, he immediately knows he doesn't want that smoke, because this is all open space that is incredibly hard for the Queen to cross, right? If he moves from where he is right now to that corner, he will die. So what does Crocs do? He drops off and he's like, you know what? I don't want that smoke, right? I'm all chill there. Now, maybe that's a little bit of an over-analysis there, considering his cast does die, but I think that reasoning is sound. This is a bit more favourable, right? This is a little bit closer, but you can see there's some decent amount of distance between himself and the enemy Ramattra, and he knows that he's going to lose that brawl trade if he walks forward and tries to brawl the Ramattra. So again, he lives to fight another day. Doubles back, there we go. And then this angle becomes significantly more free, and of course I used this example a little bit earlier. You can see right now, this is exactly what Crocs wants. Very short sightline onto the Lucio, very easy to punish him, and again avoiding that entire clot of open space that he otherwise would have had to pass had he gone through main. Now onto the tank matchups. Starting with D.Va, and the key is paying attention to her boosters. More specifically, whenever D.Va wants to do something, like dive a target, she's missing out on using an aspect of her kit, like peeling her backline. Her boosters indirectly tell you what gaps you can be punishing in her play. For example, if she flies to an angle and leaves a squishy vulnerable, go and duel that squishy. You should almost never be finding yourself brawling D.Va up close unless your comp is built for it. Your damage gets halved because of her armor, you've got no armor yourself, and she can eat your knives too. Now onto Doomfist. Of course, it's easy to say that Queen beats Doom, especially because he's got no armor to mitigate your shots, but do be wary of charging his Empower Punch with your knife. Greeding the damage isn't always better, but if he's using block as a last-ditch attempt to live, then knife can be quite disruptive. When he exits Meteor Strike 2, you can time your knives for an easy hit. Now, I know Hazard isn't officially released yet, and there's very little data on how Hazard plays as a whole, but I do have some juicy, pioneering theory by the one and only Coach Coffee that might give us an insight into how this matchup plays out. Now, I don't want to give too much away, but from what I've heard, Hazard plays and occupies a similar position to D.Va, in the sense that both heroes can do everything. And considering Hazard has got less armor than D.Va, no way of mitigating his knife, a block similar to Doomfist without the burst damage of Doomfist, I am a bit more inclined to say naturally, Queen plays well into Hazards. Now Queen versus Mauga. Historically, this one should favour Queen, because the hitbox you have onto Mauga is significantly better than the hitbox Mauga has onto you. Knife him around corners to try and force out a bad stomp early, and or knife him after he lands a stomp to disrupt his engage. I do want to briefly bring up this clip of Toronto Defiant juggling aggro, so to say. In this example, Toronto's Genji plays close enough to his Queen, where as soon as TVNT pops his cardiac overdrive, Sugarfree can deflect in front of the Mauga, so the Mauga stops shooting, meaning he gets no lifesteal. This ends up relieving a lot of pressure off of the Queen, who can then continue to brawl. Queen versus Orisa. In a vacuum, this matchup is heavily Orisa favoured. She's got infinite armor, more range, and if she hits a good spear, she could force out your shout too. I'm not even gonna dwell on the possibility of her stunning you out of your ultimates. Instead, the times we have seen Queen being played into Orisa is with a Zen, and fortunately, being the extremely efficient content creator I am, I've explained that matchup in the past. In short, the Queen team plays to burn the CDs of the Orisa, either by poke or by Queen knife, and then after the Orisa CDs have been burnt, Queen should be better in the brawl. We saw Gambit 2 days ago try and play Zen Queen, using the Zen spam to pressure Orisa CDs to give the Queen more leeway. We even saw O3 Splash in America try do it, but with an Echo variation instead of the Zen. In this example, the Echo spams the Orisa from distance, which forces the Orisa to turn, which allows the Queen to get a good knife. Romani gets the Fortify out with his knife, which allow him to just walk up on point and almost kill the Orisa outright. So why isn't Queen being played universally? Well, in short, Queen sustain is minimal. No armor, low standard HP, and a Juno Kiriko backline can stop your ultimate entirely. We saw this with Gambit, where the Queen gets melted before the Juno can even get the Ray down, meaning that the Ray was wasted. Queen vs Ramattra. Generally favourable for Queen for similar reasons to Mauga. Just avoid open space, since the ramp can slow you and land consistent headshots while you sit there doing fuck all. Queen vs Ryan. I don't want to keep repeating myself here, but it isn't too dissimilar to the Ramattra matchup. Where Reinhardt has less poke than Ram, the new issue you've got to deal with is Shatter, which, I'm not gonna lie, becomes very hard to actually deal with without having your team bail you out. Try and avoid directly brawling Ryan unless he's low, and the goal should almost always be getting on top of squishies. Queen vs Hog. Generally a very favourable matchup for US Queen. You've got the way better hitbox, the better ultimates, the more flexible hook, and the better gun. This shouldn't be too complicated, just don't fully tunnel vision on the Hog, especially if he isn't dying. Queen vs Sigma. Sigma can whittle you down at distance, he can block your knife with both his shield and grasp, and even up close, things aren't looking better as he can still rock you. The key here, similar to Orisa, is winning the cooldown trade either by sneaking in knives whenever the Sigma retracts his shield, or straight up ignoring the Sigma and focusing on more killable targets. Queen vs Winston. Every human being on this planet has talked about knifing Winston to pull him back when he jumps out. It's pretty obvious. What's not so obvious is when to ignore the Winston. Here, Jumpin sees the enemy Winston drop his bubble, and he immediately switches target and pathing to go onto the enemy Ana. How many Queens do you know would have just walked at the Winston, got naded, and got little value? Queen vs Ball. He's an easy knife after he lands Pile Driver, especially when he comes out of his ball form to keep shooting. Ball's mobility allows him to avoid you entirely, and he can focus on controlling sections of the map that you've got no business in being in. This can be hard to deal with, but when Ball is busy around balling, don't necessarily try and match him. Instead, focus on zoning the Ball's backline whenever he does go in, which will be the easier and more valuable thing for you to do. And lastly, Queen vs Zarya. On paper, of course, Zarya can beat you. The bubbles cleanse your ultimates, and any brawl move you want to make, like swinging your Carnage, you can't always do because Zarya will just bubble it. You can potentially bait a bubble by activating your Carnage and purposely missing it when the Zarya bubbles. But on a macro level, the key to beating Zarya lays in your team comp, either looking to run over the Zarya with a Mei, Sim or Reaper, or looking to go past the Zarya with a more mobile DPS lineup. Well, that's it for the guides. Don't forget to subscribe, like and comment, and if this video helped to raise your IQ, be sure to share it with your friends to also raise theirs. Until next time.